You have probably heard this story before. A man reaches out to steady the Ark of the Covenant, and God strikes him down instantly. Most people read this and think God was cruel, or that Uzzah simply had bad luck on the wrong day. But the Bible hides a detail most readers skip past without ever noticing. The real problem never happened at the moment Uzzah touched the Ark. It happened hours earlier, in a decision nobody questioned, involving a new cart and a method borrowed from a nation that never knew the God of Israel. Once you see what was ignored before that touch, this story will never read the same way again. For most of Christian history, this story has been treated as a warning about carelessness, a tragic accident that spiraled into divine punishment. Sunday school lessons often reduce it to a single takeaway: don't touch the Ark. But that explanation has always left something unresolved. If God simply wanted obedience, why would judgment fall on a man who acted by every human measure with good intentions? The tension in this story is not a flaw in the text. It is a signal that something deeper is waiting beneath the surface. To understand what really happened that day, we have to step back further than most retellings ever go. The moment Uzzah reached out was not the beginning of the problem. It was the final link in a chain of decisions that had already been set in motion long before the Ark ever left its resting place. Scripture rarely records tragedy without also recording the quiet choices that led there, and this story is no exception. This is why so many readers walk away from this passage feeling unsettled rather than instructed. They are examining the last 5 seconds of a much longer sequence, expecting it to explain everything on its own. But the Bible is structured differently. It rewards readers who are willing to look earlier, to notice what was arranged, who was consulted, and what was quietly overlooked in the process of moving something sacred. What makes this passage so significant is not simply what happened to one man in ancient Israel. It is what this account reveals about the difference between sincerity and faithfulness, a distinction that reappears throughout Scripture in ways most readers never connect back to this moment. Once that connection becomes visible, this story stops being a troubling anomaly and becomes one of the clearest teaching moments in the entire Old Testament. Stay with us until the end, because the final piece of this puzzle changes everything. If you're fascinated by hidden layers of Scripture and biblical discoveries most people overlook, subscribe to the channel and join us on this journey through the Bible. Before the Ark ever moved that day, a decision had already been made that set everything in motion. David chose to transport it on a new cart, a method that sounds practical, even respectful. A new cart suggests care, intention, something built specifically for this sacred purpose. But Scripture had already established, generations earlier, exactly how the Ark was to be carried. Not by wheels, not by animals, by the shoulders of consecrated Levites, using poles fitted through rings on the Ark itself. This instruction was not a minor ceremonial preference. It was given with unusual precision, repeated across multiple books of the Torah, and tied directly to the holiness of the object being moved. The Ark represented the very presence of God among his people. The method of carrying it was never meant to be a matter of convenience or creativity. It was meant to reflect reverence through exact obedience, not through good intentions dressed up as tradition. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The idea of placing the Ark on a cart did not originate with Israel at all. Years earlier, when the Philistines had captured the Ark and suffered disaster after disaster because of it, they devised their own method of returning it. They built a new cart, pulled by cattle, and sent the Ark back toward Israelite territory. It worked, in the sense that the Ark arrived safely. David's generation, generations removed from the original wilderness instructions, seems to have remembered that the Philistines succeeded using a cart without fully remembering why the original method had been given in the first place. A practical solution, borrowed from a nation that had no covenant relationship with God, was adopted for a task that demanded covenant faithfulness. The intention was reverent. The source was not aligned with what God had actually commanded. This is the first piece of the puzzle most readers never notice. The new cart was not simply an oversight. It was a return to a method that had only ever worked outside the boundaries of what God prescribed for his own people. Something borrowed from Philistine necessity had quietly replaced something instituted by divine instruction, and no one at the time seemed to question it. What makes this so unsettling is not that David acted with disrespect. He clearly did not. He was celebrating, worshiping, bringing the ark home with genuine joy. But joy and celebration were never the missing ingredient in this story. Something else was missing, something that would not become visible until the procession was already underway. As the procession moved forward, another detail emerges that most retellings skip entirely. At a place called the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen pulling the cart stumbled. This single moment, brief and almost incidental in the text, is the hinge on which the entire story turns. It was not an ambush. It was not a punishment already underway. It was simply an ox losing its footing on uneven ground, exactly the kind of moment a cart-based system was always vulnerable to. This is where Uzzah reaches out. His action reads, on the surface, as instinctive and protective. The ark was tilting. He extended his hand to steady it. Nearly every reader who encounters this story for the first time reacts the same way modern audiences do. He was trying to help, so why would this be the moment judgment falls? But the text is not evaluating the sincerity of his heart in this instant. It is revealing the consequence of a system that should never have placed the ark in that position of vulnerability at all. Here is where the original language adds a layer easily missed in translation. The Hebrew text describes God's anger as being kindled specifically because Uzzah reached out or stretched forth his hand toward the ark, using language that echoes earlier warnings in the Torah about unauthorized contact with sacred objects. This was not merely touching something forbidden by accident. It was direct, physical contact with the one object in all of Israel's worship system explicitly set apart from human hands, even well-intentioned ones. This raises the question every attentive reader eventually asks. If the ark was never meant to be touched under any circumstances, why was it positioned in a way that made touching it at some point almost inevitable? A cart bouncing over uneven terrain was always going to shift and tilt. The vulnerability was built into the method chosen at the very beginning of the journey, long before Uzzah ever extended his hand. This is the moment the two threads of the story finally intersect. The earlier decision to abandon the prescribed carrying method and this later, seemingly spontaneous act of reaching out are not two separate events. They are cause and effect. The stumbling ox did not create the danger. It simply exposed a danger that had existed from the moment the ark was placed on a cart instead of the shoulders of consecrated men. What happened next would force an entire nation and centuries of readers afterward to confront an uncomfortable truth about the difference between honoring God with enthusiasm and honoring God with obedience. That truth is where this story finally reveals what it has been building toward all along. This is the moment where every earlier detail converges into a single, unavoidable realization. Uzzah's death was never really about the half-second his hand made contact with the ark. It was the visible outcome of a much longer sequence of decisions that had quietly departed from what God had clearly instructed. Decisions made with sincerity, but without consulting what had already been revealed. The tragedy of this story is not that God is arbitrary or harsh. The tragedy is that an entire process, celebrated with music, dancing, and genuine national joy, had been built on a foundation that ignored explicit divine instruction. David and the people around him were not indifferent to God. They were enthusiastic, engaged, and sincere. But sincerity was never the missing element the story hinges on. This is where the deeper pattern becomes visible. Throughout Scripture, God consistently distinguishes between approaching him with heartfelt intention and approaching him according to what he has actually revealed. Cain's offering, Saul's incomplete obedience regarding Amalek, and now Uzzah's cart all share the same underlying structure. Good intentions substituted for precise obedience, and in each case, the substitution carried consequences no one anticipated until it was too late. Once this pattern comes into focus, the entire narrative reorganizes itself. The stumbling ox was not the cause of judgment. The reaching hand was not the cause of judgment. Both were simply the final, visible moments in a chain that began the instant someone decided a new cart, borrowed from a nation with no covenant with God, was an acceptable substitute for the method God himself had prescribed. This reframes the story's entire emotional center. It is not a story about a God who punishes helpful impulses. It is a story about how holiness cannot be approached casually, even when the approach is wrapped in celebration and goodwill. The ark represented God's presence among his people, and that presence was never meant to be handled according to whatever method seemed most convenient at the time. David himself understood this. After Uzzah's death, he did not simply repeat the same procession weeks later. He returned to the original instructions, and when the ark finally entered Jerusalem, it was carried by Levites on their shoulders, exactly as it had been commanded from the beginning. The correction was not emotional, it was procedural, and it worked. This story has often been remembered as one of the most difficult passages in the Old Testament, a moment that seems to contradict the character of a loving God. But once the earlier decisions are brought back into view, the difficulty resolves into something far more coherent. This was never a story about punishing a helpful gesture. It was a story about what happens when sincere devotion is not paired with faithful obedience to what God has actually said. The lesson extends far beyond an ancient procession and a wooden cart. Every generation faces its own version of this same temptation, finding a method that feels reverent, practical, or emotionally satisfying, without pausing to ask whether it actually aligns with what has already been revealed. Enthusiasm has never been the substitute Scripture calls for. Faithfulness to what God has spoken has always been the deeper requirement. The next time you read this passage, notice what changes when you stop focusing solely on the moment Uzzah's hand touched the ark. Notice the cart. Notice where the method came from. Notice how far back the real decision was made. The story becomes less about a single tragic instant and more about a principle that runs through the entire biblical narrative. The difference between approaching God on our own terms and approaching Him on His. This is what makes Scripture endlessly layered. A passage read 100 times can still reveal something new once the surrounding context is finally brought into focus. The story of Uzzah is not an isolated incident of divine severity. It is a window into how God has always valued precise faithfulness over well-meaning improvisation. If this changed the way you understand this passage, we would love to hear it. Leave a comment below and share which part of this discovery surprised you the most. There are more overlooked layers like this throughout Scripture, waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue this journey through the hidden depths of the Bible.